Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Wild, Wild Death, the show where we talk about all the ways people became explorers of the great beyond in the Old West. Each week, we spin the wagon wheel of untimely demise, and whatever manner of death it lands on, we tell you a story about it. My name is Jack James Busa.
I'm Leslie Sadali.
And I'm Susan Busa Leshner. It's a rainy day here in Austin, Texas, but we're all cozy inside, ready to listen to a story about death in the Old West. So why don't we get started? Leslie, will you spin the wagon wheel of untimely demise?
Yes, I will. Here we go.
Another day, another death.
Okay, it looks like today our cause of death is hanging, but also something more.
That pesky wagon wheel of untimely demise. What a tease.
I've got a story for that, and this is quite a tale. And I want to warn you that there are a couple places where it gets kind of gruesome, so we'll give you a heads up before we get to those sections.
Oh, boy.
This is the story of a bandit with one of the worst nicknames in outlaw history. As an outlaw, he wasn't really successful, or famous for that matter. But after he died, he wound up in a front row seat at the inauguration of the governor. Well, at least part of him did. This is the story of Big Nose George Parrott.
Big Nose George Parrott?
You've got to be kidding me.
When you see a picture of him, you will see that I am not.
Yeah, the last name Parrott wasn't enough to comment on his nose. They had to be very sure that everyone knew he had a gigantic nose.
Okay. George Parrott was born on March 20th, 1834 in France. Eventually, George wound up in the Wyoming, Montana, and Dakota territories, and that's where he took up the profession of horse thief, cattle rustler, and stagecoach robber. He wasn't a high-profile outlaw. In fact, I don't think the word outlaw really applies to George. If he was around today, he'd be the guy swiping a catalytic converter off a car in a driveway or holding up a convenience store for the money in the cash register. Sometimes George would imply that he was part of a really famous gang, like he rode with Jesse James. But he didn't. He was just a run-of-the-mill, pain-in-the-ass petty thief. But there was definitely something about George that made him memorable. George had a very large nose. His nose was so large.
How large
How
was
it?
It was so large that there was only one nickname that would do. So everybody called him Big Nose George.
Yeah.
And when folks talked about Big Nose George, everyone knew exactly which George they were talking about.
Okay, you notice how nicknames are never like handsome and smart Paul. Always like busted and broke down Betty, like jeez.
Sometimes they're cool, like Butch Cassidy. Anyway, here's a picture of him.
Yeah. Okay, let me see the picture of Big Nose George. I love his nose. But I think it is very big. His other nicknames, Big Nose George, Big Beat Parrot. But you know, I think big noses are very attractive.
Well, he had one, so that makes him the most handsome guy in Wyoming, clearly.
Clearly.
You know what they say about guys with big noses?
What?
Big nose hairs. Uh-huh.
All right, back to Big Nose George. Well, he was this petty thief, but Big Nose George had bigger dreams.
Bigger than his nose.
He didn't just want to steal horses or take pocket watches from people riding the stagecoach or be known for his nose. George wanted to be in the outlaw big time. He wanted to be a train robber. So, in August of 1878, that's what Big Nose George and his gang, which included a guy named Dutch Charlie Burris, set out to do. Their plan was to stop a Union Pacific Railroad train and rob the car that was carrying the payroll. What they did is they went to a remote location on the train tracks near Medicine Bow, Wyoming, and loosened a spike from one of the rails on the tracks. The idea was they'd wrap some wire around the spike, hide in the bushes, and then when the train came down the tracks, they'd use the wire to pull the spike from the rail, which would force the train to stop. And then they could get on the train, grab the money, and take off.
Okay.
Unfortunately for their plans, a railroad employee came down the tracks and he was inspecting the rails for damage, and he saw that a spike was out of place. But this employee was pretty cool. He didn't make a reaction, but he went down and he stopped the train before it could get derailed, and then he told local lawmen about it. So, Big Nose George, Dutch Charlie, and the rest of the gang figured a posse would be coming for them, so they hightailed it out of there and headed toward a place called Rattlesnake Canyon. They picked an area where they could see the lawmen coming and set up a barrier where they wouldn't be seen and settled into their hideout. On August 19th, lawmen tracked them down, but when they arrived, they walked into an ambush. There was a gunfight, and a Union Pacific Railroad agent named Tip Vincent and a deputy sheriff named Robert Whittlesfield were killed. And these two guys were the first lawmen to be killed in the line of duty in Wyoming. And then, after they were dead, Big Nose George, Dutch Charlie, and the others stripped the bodies of any valuables and took the horses and the saddles. Then they buried the bodies in the canyon to hide them. The next thing they did was head for Montana to hide out, and they were committing robberies all along the way until they eventually split up.
Whoa.
But evidently, Big Nose couldn't keep his big mouth shut. He would get drunk and brag about almost robbing a train and killing the lawmen who came after them. And having such an obvious nose made him memorable and instantly recognizable, so who needs a mugshot?
Yeah, they could really sniff out that guy.
Nasal humor. All of this yapping put a U.S. Marshal on their tail. Eventually, Dutch Charlie was caught and brought back to Carbon, Wyoming on a train. So here's the part where it gets kind of gruesome, and you can skip ahead if you want to, but you've been warned here. So if you're going to stay, buckle up.
I'm buckled.
Here's an account of what happened next by a guy named John Milliken Sr. He's an old-timer from Carbon and Hannah, Wyoming. So this is what he had to say. Quote, "The citizens of Carbon found out that he was coming, and they all marched, big and little, and young and old, and when the train stopped at Carbon to take coal and water, they all marched in a body through the passenger coaches looking for Dutch Charlie. They knew he was on the train, and when they found he wasn't in the passenger coaches, they went to the express car and asked for admittance. They were refused, so they broke the door in. They went in with guns. There were 2 sheriffs and an expressman in the car, and they were told to throw your hands up. They all stood up with their hands in the air. Then the men said, 'Where are they?' meaning the bandits, meaning Dutch Charlie. The mob wasn't given any satisfaction, and one of them said, 'If you don't tell us where they are, we will get you.' There they stood with their hands in the air, and one of the sheriffs pointed toward a bunch of buffalo robes on the floor of the car. And when they went and pulled aside the buffalo robes, there was Dutch Charlie underneath them. He had chains on his feet and was handcuffed. They pulled him out and stood him on a 50-gallon whiskey barrel and had a rope flung over a telephone pole. One of the leaders of the mob said, 'Now, if you will tell us the truth and all about who killed Vincent and Whitfield, we will see you get a fair trial." Dutch Charlie said, "I don't know nothing about it, but if you'll let me go, I'll help catch them all. I've heard about it, but I don't know nothing about it." They went through his pockets, and all they found was about 2.5 inches of chewing tobacco and a box of salve. One of the men grabbed Dutch Charlie by the arm, and he flinched, and the man said, "What's the matter here?" And Dutch Charlie said, "A stray bullet hit me." Then they said, "Now we're not going to take any more chances with you, and if you don't acknowledge everything, we'll string you up." "All right, boys," Dutch Charlie says. "I am innocent, but I will guarantee you I will catch them if you'll let me go." And they said, "We can't let you go. We have to hang you up." "Don't, boys," he said. And Dutch Charlie was standing on the barrel all this time. They got awfully tired of him, and they stretched the rope. They said 1, 2, 3, all together, and they pulled him off. Then they let him down. During this time, Bob Whitfield's half-brother had brought Bob Whitfield's mother over to look at Dutch Charlie. She looked at him and she said, "You bad man, you shot my poor son." Then the crowd got excited and said, "Up he goes," and away he went. I'll bet they pulled him up 12 times. Each time he came down kerplop, and his neck was stretching. All this time, he was standing on the barrel with his head turned over and up. The barrel would move one way and then another. Back and forth, it seesawed from side to side. They gave him a few more pulls, and I guess his neck was stretched a good 18 inches.
Oh.
Is that even possible?
I honestly don't know. That's what this guy is saying.
Wow.
Anyway, back to John Milliken's story. They tied him up hanging to the telephone pole and left him until the sheriff came down from Rawlings the next morning. When the passenger train came through that morning, the men and conductors pulled all the curtains down so they couldn't see Dutch Charlie hanging on the pole.
Wow.
Yeah, they pulled him up and down. You know how high telegraph poles are? They threw a rope over it and were pulling him up and down like he was a toy.
Torturing him. I mean, he wasn't great, or he was a bad dude, but geez.
I read a report where law enforcement came in later and asked the people of the town what they saw, and everybody said they didn't see anything.
That'd be very hard to miss, but...
That account from John Milliken was given years later. In the meantime, Big Nose George was spending time in a bar in Miles City, Montana, bragging about his misdeeds, including the killing of the 2 lawmen. I mean, come on, George, you gotta be smarter than that.
George, a lot of these criminal stories we do, the guys are always really proud of themselves. And they get caught because they're like, you know what I did? I did something illegal. I killed these guys. Isn't that cool? And everyone goes, what? And then tells somebody. And then they go, oh, I can't believe I was found out. Like, yeah, dude, you just bragged to everyone at the watering hole.
They're all less than brilliant.
Honestly, I think if you're going to be this kind of an outlaw, it's probably a good idea if you don't drink.
Yeah, don't drink.
So that's what he was doing. He was bragging in the bar. And, of course, word got out. And the Carbon County Sheriff James Rankin went up to Montana and arrested George and took him to Rawlings, Wyoming, where he stood trial and was found guilty of the murders of the lawmen. He actually got to go all the way to trial. George was sentenced to hang on April 2nd, 1881. But on March 22nd, George decided to make a break from jail. He managed to saw off his leg shackles, and he hit the jailer over the head, cracking his skull.
Whoa!
What?
George took the keys, but before he could make his escape, the jailer's wife showed up with a gun.
Oh, she's cool.
She fired it in the air to signal for help, and men came running. It wasn't long before a mob descended on the jail. Even though the jailer's wife wanted to put George back in his cell to await his execution, the mob wasn't having it. They dragged George out of the jail and strung him up on, guess what? a telephone pole.
They're good at this now.
The first rope broke, and George fell to the ground. But they got another rope and strung him up again. And evidently, it was so brutal that in the middle of all this, George lost an ear.
Oh, my.
But this time, George did not get away. Now, this is where it seems like it's the end of the story. But it's not. So his body hung there for a while, and as there was no next of kin, two enterprising doctors, Dr. McGee and Dr. John Eugene Osborne, took possession of the body because they wanted to do some experiments.
Okay.
They wanted to check out George's brain to see if there were any abnormalities in it that might explain criminal behavior. So this next part is really not for the squeamish, so if you kind of feel that way, you might want to skip ahead.
Oh, my.
Before we get into this next part, the townspeople of each town we're talking about, where they string guys up by the telephone poles, are very happy to string them up. But then no one wants to get the body back down, it sounds like. They're just totally fine decorating their town in the carcass of criminals. And I think that is just irresponsible because it is an eyesore. And I do not want to look at that while I'm going to get my groceries.
It's disgusting for so many reasons.
Just wanted to say, I know those doctors are weird for getting the body. I guess it's not that weird if you're a doctor, but I'd be like, yeah, take them. I don't want to look at that anymore. It's like having a Christmas tree up in March, but infinitely more disgusting and unjoyous.
Yeah. So these doctors cut George down and took his body to their office to do some experiments. But first, they made a death mask of George's face to preserve what he looked like. And I got to say, they did a really good job. There'll be a link to a picture of it in the show notes so you can see what it looked like if you're interested in seeing
What
that.
is a death mask?
It's when you put plaster over somebody's face to make a cast of it.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It wasn't an unusual thing to do.
Oh, wow.
There's
I like that.
death masks of famous people. Anyway, so they made this death mask of George's face, and then they got to work on their experiment. First, they cut his skull in two, removing the top half. They poked around looking at his brain for anything that looked unusual, and they didn't find anything. They could have stopped there, but they didn't.
Not if they're on our show.
Next, they carefully removed the skin from George's chest and sent it to a tannery in Denver, where it was used to make a pair of shoes and a medicine bag.
What?
No.
Yes.
That doesn't sound so scientific to me.
Nope. By some accounts, Dr. Osborne was disappointed that the tannery did not put George's nipples on the tips of the shoes as he requested.
Oh my God. Okay.
That's a first. I've never heard this.
Yeah, it's weird. So, to continue, the top of the skull was given to Dr. McGee's assistant, Lillian Heath, as a keepsake. She used the skull cap as a place to hold her pens, and by some accounts, she also used it as a doorstop and sometimes as an ashtray. Lillian Heath eventually became Wyoming's first female physician.
Okay. I'm still hung up on the nipples on the shoes because so much. First of all, whoa. Second of all, if this guy is already making shoes out of human skin And a medicine bag, I like that he draws the line at nipples on the top of the shoes. That is just too far. The rest of it is A-okay.
My guess is that if they're willing to make the shoes and the medicine bag, then maybe it was just too hard to position the nipples on the tops of the shoes. If you're okay with doing the other, I think it was just maybe too difficult, and that's why they didn't do it.
Yeah, it was
Well, that is so weird. Okay. So, and also, I'm trying to put take a walk in their shoes. Why you would want... I wouldn't even think about it, but now I'm thinking about it. That's disgusting.
For me, the moment when they're in there doing the experiment and then they don't find anything, and they go, well, what do you want to do now?
Fashion.
haute couture.
I mean, wow. Wow. That was the choice. I mean, wow. I mean, they could have said, let's bury him. But nope. Anyway, the next thing they did do was to take the remaining parts of George's body, pack it into a whiskey barrel filled with a salt solution, and bury it in the yard of Dr. McGee's office in Rawlins. In 1893, Dr. Osborne became governor of Wyoming, and as part of his inauguration attire, he wore the shoes made from Big Nose George's skin. And by some accounts, he also wore them to the inaugural ball, where he danced the night away in those shoes.
Oh my God.
You know, I really have to say this was one of the harder ones for me to write. I had to take a couple of pauses on this one because the initial, botched robbery was in 1878, and then George Parrott was hung. 2 mob hangings, by the way, in 1881, and then they did the experiments, but the doctor wasn't inaugurated till more than 10 years later. So he kept the shoes all that time and put them on because it was a special occasion.
That's really twisted.
They were a conversation piece. Do you think he mentioned to people when he was wearing them that they were made from human leather?
Why else would you put them on? Why
Yeah.
else would you put them on?
Yeah, they're like special shoes in his mind. So that's really disturbing.
Some of this is really crazy, but the amount of brutality all along the line here is pretty breathtaking.
Yeah.
It makes you think about human nature because to me, there's nobody in this story that's a good guy.
Except maybe the jailer's wife.
Yeah, the jailer's wife, yeah.
Yeah. True.
When the inauguration party was over, turns out that was not the end of George's story. In 1950, construction workers in Rawlins were doing some excavating as part of the construction of a new department store. They unearthed a whiskey barrel containing human bones and a skull with the top sawed off, and these remains were identified as those of Big Nose George. Now, I could not find out if George's remains were ultimately buried, but the bottom half of his skull and his death mask and the shoes made from his skin are on display at the Carbon County Museum in Rawlins, Wyoming. And the top half of his skull and the shackles used during his hanging are in the Union Pacific Museum in Council Bluff, Iowa. But the medicine bag made from his skin has never been found.
Wow.
If you want to know more about the story, please visit the links in our show notes and follow us on social media at The Wild Wild Death.
You can also check out other shows that 2222 Media has to offer at 2222media.com. That's 2222 Media spelled out.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.
Adios, muchachos. Mwah.
The Wild Wild Death is a production of 2222 Media.